There are moments when the world stops making sense. When logic sits quietly in the corner and something ancient stirs within us, something we can't name but we've always known. You might call it fate. Others call it instinct. But for one woman, it appeared as a pair of eyes in the smoke. Most people don't survive plane crashes. Fewer walk away with a story no one wants to believe. And almost none of them say they were saved, not by a person, not by a miracle, but by a wild animal no one else saw. But what if you did survive alone? What if something found you in the dark and showed you the only way out? Today's story isn't about luck. It's not about bravery. It's about a whisper that came when everything else was fire and silence. If you've ever believed that nature sees us, if you've ever felt watched not in fear but in stillness, you may already know the truth. Let me tell you a story that begins not with an ending, but with a gaze. Some goodbyes arrive without warning. Others linger quietly waiting in the corners of our lives, disguised as ordinary days. For Elena Monroe, her final moment of before wasn't a siren, a scream, or a sense of doom. It was a pair of amber eyes staring at her across a field of turning leaves. Eleanor wasn't the type to believe in omens. At 29, she was a practical woman, an art teacher who paid her bills on time, volunteered at the local library, and tended to her grandmother's overgrown garden every weekend. She lived in Missoula, Montana, and shared a small rental home with her younger sister Hazel. Their relationship was a quiet harmony. Hazel was the fire, spontaneous and bold, while Elena was the anchor, slow to speak, but deep with care. That September, they returned to Kalispell, the town where they were born. Their mother had passed away 5 years earlier, and the family home, an old wood-frame cottage tucked behind a maple grove, had sat empty ever since. The plan was simple. Spend one weekend sorting through memories, deciding what to keep and letting go of the rest. The first evening felt like time itself had curled into a loop. Elena sat on the back porch, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, staring into the tangle of dry grass and fading wildflowers behind the fence. The air carried that distinct scent of early fall pine needles, sun-warmed wood, and something faintly sweet, like apples just beginning to rot. Hazel was inside playing a playlist their mom used to love. It drifted through the screen door, a haunting violin, then a voice Elena hadn't heard since childhood. The kind of moment that makes your heart ache, not from pain, but from the weight of memory. And then it happened. A flicker near the far fence. Subtle, silent. At first she thought it was a fox, but when she focused, she saw it clearly, a bobcat. Small, lean, with tufted ears and a coat that blended with the golden weeds. It didn't move, just stood there as if it had always been part of the landscape. Its gaze met hers not in fear, not in challenge, but in recognition. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Something is unnerving about being looked at by a creature that doesn't need language to speak. Elena couldn't explain it, but she felt seen, not just noticed, but understood. The way you only feel when someone who truly loves you catches your glance across a crowded room. Then, as quietly as it came, the bobcat turned and disappeared into the brush. Elena blinked. Her heart was racing, but nothing had happened. No growl, no chase, just a moment. A moment she couldn't shake. Later that night, she told Hazel. "You saw a cat in the yard?" Hazel laughed, tossing a hoodie into her suitcase. "I'm not surprised. You always do this before we travel. Weird dreams, strange animals. I think you're more spiritual than you admit." Elena didn't argue, but she didn't laugh either. That night, she dreamt she was on fire, but not burning. She was walking through smoke, barefoot, lost. And just ahead of her, always just far enough to stay out of reach, were those eyes again. Not leading, not pulling, just there. The next morning, they headed to Glacier Regional Airport. It was early, still dark. Their flight connected through Seattle before heading back to Missoula. At the gate, a staff member asked if they'd like to move seats. There were 2 empty spots over the wing rows, 14E and 14F. Hazel shrugged. Sure, why not? Elena hesitated, then nodded. As they boarded, Elena paused at the door of the plane. She couldn't explain it, but her skin tingled. Something about the smell of metal and fuel. Something about the way the sky had turned from indigo to that pre-dawn gray. She touched the crescent moon pendant at her neck, a small charm her mother had given her on her 21st birthday. "It's silly," her mom had said, "but when you wear this, nothing bad can happen." "Not really." Hazel smiled as they buckled in. "Just think by tonight we'll be home and this whole weekend will feel like a dream." Eleanor turned to the window. Below, the airstrip stretched into mist. Beyond the fence, just as the plane began to taxi, she saw it. The Bobcat, standing beside the runway lights, tail still ears forward, watching the plane, watching her. She gasped, leaned forward, but by the time she blinked, it was gone. Hazel noticed. What is it?" Elena shook her head. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something." There was no fear, only the faintest pulse of knowing, like déjà vu soaked in silence. We often talk about signs as if they must be loud, flashy, divine. But sometimes a sign is a shadow in the light, a breath in the stillness, a gaze that stays with you long after it's gone. In that moment, Elena didn't understand what she was seeing. She only knew that everything felt heavier. The air, her chest, even the clouds outside seemed to lean toward her window. She didn't know that just 15 minutes later, everything she understood about life would be undone. But the eyes had already seen it coming. Sometimes the most important warnings don't come from words. They come from feelings, from subtle nudges we dismiss as imagination, but the body remembers what the mind denies. And when we look back, it's often the quietest moments that hold the loudest truth. If you've ever ignored a feeling in your chest, one that whispered, "Pay attention, you're not alone," maybe this story will help you listen more closely. But the warning had already passed. And the sky, now gold with morning, held no clues of what was about to fall. That was the last moment Elena ever felt like herself. The next moment, it would be the one the world would never forget. Sometimes life changes in the middle of a sentence. Elena was mid-conversation with Hazel, laughing about how dry the airplane muffins always were when it happened. One moment the cabin was filled with the soft murmur of passengers settling in the rustle of overhead bins, the buzz of someone adjusting their reading light. And the next, it was a sound she would never forget, a deep, guttural bang that didn't feel like sound at all, but pressure, a shifting of everything. The plane jolted so hard, her coffee tilted sideways. The seatbelt sign flickered, then died. A metallic groan echoed from beneath the floor, like the bones of the aircraft were no longer sure they could hold their weight. Then came the screams. From 30,000 feet, they were dropping. Not gently, not like turbulence. No, this was a fall. The kind of gravity never intended to stop. Hazel's fingers clutched Elena's forearm. "What is another crash?" Something exploded toward the rear. Then silence for a second that felt like forever. The flight attendants were shouting, trying to calm the chaos. But it was too late. The lights flickered off completely. Darkness swallowed them except for the distant glow of fire and the unnatural orange flashing through the windows. Eleanor looked to her right. Through the small oval of glass, the trees were coming into view. Too fast, too close. She didn't have time to think, just instinct. She tightened her seatbelt. Hazel didn't have time to check hers. And then, impact. The forest near Flathead Lake would never forget what fell from the sky that morning. The aircraft shattered across a grove of pine and stone, its tail section splitting against a boulder, its fuselage crumpling like a toy. Fuel ignited within seconds. Metal screamed windows, imploded bodies thrown like rag dolls into fire, earth and silence. No one screamed for long. Elena didn't remember the moment her seat was ripped sideways. Only that she came to in a haze of blood and smoke, her cheek pressed against something sticky and hot metal most likely. Or bone. Maybe her own. The air was unbreathable. She coughed, blinked, and tried to sit up. Pain bolted down her spine like lightning. Her legs were trapped beneath the remnants of someone else's seat. The smell of gasoline and burning flesh coated everything. She didn't cry, not yet. Her mind hadn't caught up. It was still in the sky. All around her, nothing, just debris, and silence so loud it felt alive. Then she heard it, or maybe felt it first. A breath, a shift in the smoke, and there, just at the edge of the wreckage where the torn open shell of the plane met the mangled roots of a fallen tree, stood a figure. Not a firefighter, not a person. A bobcat. It was standing there, right there, just beyond the reach of the flames. Its fur was singed near one ear, eyes gleaming with the same amber light she had seen just 2 nights before. She blinked. It didn't move. It didn't run. It didn't look afraid. It simply looked at her. The same way it had behind her childhood home, the same way it had across the airstrip, that same impossible calm, that stillness that pierced through the noise. And in that moment, something in Elena, something ancient, deeper than logic, older than fear, moved. She didn't know why she trusted those eyes, why she reached for them like a lifeline. Why did she pull her half-broken body toward that impossible figure? But she did. She dragged herself inch by inch through glass and heat-torn fabric and blood. Her fingernails split, her shin scraped open on a shard of engine casing. One arm didn't move at all, but she kept going. The bobcat didn't blink, didn't call her, didn't beckon, just stayed, a compass with a heartbeat. At the edge of the cabin, just before the walls split into forest, Elena reached the emergency door, cracked open just enough to let air through. As she pulled herself toward it, a burning beam collapsed just behind her, sealing off the rear. She didn't look back. When she reached the opening, she collapsed out of the plane onto cold, wet grass, and the world tilted again. She turned her head to see nothing. The bobcat was gone. No paw prints, no sound. Just smoke drifting upward into a sky that hadn't yet realized it was holding a secret. Sometime later, minutes, hours, she didn't know, sirens arrived. Lights danced across the trees. First responders moved quickly, shouting, searching for survivors. They found only one. Elena Monroe, passenger, 40F, bloodied, burned, alive. At the hospital, her story didn't make sense to anyone. She kept repeating it again and again to the nurses, to the police, to the man in a Navy suit from the NTSB. I followed a bobcat out. I saw it before we crashed. I saw it when I woke up. They scribbled notes, murmured words like trauma-induced hallucination and coping mechanism, but she knew what she saw. And something inside her, something beyond logic, whispered it wasn't over. In moments of unspeakable chaos, sometimes the only guide we have is the one we've been taught to ignore, our instinct. The body, the spirit, the whisper of a truth deeper than reason. Some people call it wild, some call it faith. Sometimes it shows up in a form we never expect. If you've ever been through something unexplainable and survived, maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was something watching over you in a way no one else can understand. The world called her a miracle. The only survivor of a crash that no one should have lived through. But what they didn't know was the hardest part wasn't crawling out of the fire. It was what came after. The silence, the questions, and the one gaze she couldn't forget. They called her lucky. Doctors, reporters, investigators, they all used that word like it meant something comforting. You're lucky to be alive. It's a miracle you made it. You were in the right seat at the right time. But Elena didn't feel lucky. She felt hollow. In the sterile, white room of the regional hospital, she lay alone, the hum of machines like insects in the corners. Her body ached, wrapped in gauze and bruises. But the real pain wasn't physical. It was the silence after the storm, the unbearable stillness of surviving when no one else did. Especially Hazel. When they told her Hazel hadn't made it, she didn't cry. Not right away. The nurse had been gentle, her voice soft, the words carefully chosen, but all Elena could do was blink at the ceiling, because how could she cry for someone who was just sitting next to you? How could reality shift that quickly? Later, in a moment no one noticed, she whispered her sister's name to the empty room. Just once. Hazel, like saying it aloud, might reverse time, or call her back, or make her real again. But nothing changed. She became the focus of news stories. The miracle girl. The one who walked out. Cameras waited outside the hospital. A stranger from a cable network called and offered to fly her to New York for an exclusive interview. She didn't return the call. What do you say when the world is clapping, but your heart is breaking? Every night she woke in a sweat. Sometimes she saw Hazel's hand reaching for her. Other times, it was fire. Often it was the Bobcat, those eyes neither cruel nor kind, simply aware. As if it saw what even she couldn't. The worst part wasn't the memory of the crash. It was breakfast. It was waking up and hearing only one toothbrush in the cup, one mug in the sink, one towel on the rack. Hazel wasn't there to hum as she made eggs or leave her socks on the sofa or call out sarcastic remarks from the hallway. And that's when the guilt began to root. Why me? Why did I survive? What was so special about me that I got to keep breathing? She tried to remember the last thing she'd said to Hazel. Something about airplane muffins. Something pointless. The thought that this was their last conversation haunted her more than anything. At night, she'd reach for the moon pendant, the one her mother gave her, the one she wore during the crash. Sometimes she blamed it. Sometimes she held it tight like a child, with a security blanket praying for another chance to wake up in a different world. One morning, a nurse brought in a small envelope. It had survived the wreckage tucked between the pages of Hazel's travel journal. Inside was a letter Hazel had written but never had the chance to send. She must have written it during the trip, maybe the night before the flight. It read, "If anything ever happens, I want you to remember this. You are not the quiet one. You are the strong one pretending to be quiet. You're the one who sees the world more deeply than anyone I know. That's your gift. And if the worst ever comes, don't hide from it. Feel it. Let it undo you. Then, rebuild from there." Elena read it again and again. She didn't cry the first time. But on the fourth reading, something cracked. She wept. Not the kind of tears that fall gently, but the kind that come in waves that leave you breathless. The kind of crying that carries grief out from the body like salt from an open wound. The therapists said she was experiencing survivor's guilt, that it was common, expected even. Many people who live through traumatic events struggle with the burden of being alive. But nothing felt common about this. How do you explain the weight of breathing when someone else can no longer? How do you go back to emails and errands and grocery shopping when your sister's seat is forever empty? Some people said, she would want you to keep living. Maybe that was true. But Elena didn't want cliches. She wanted Hazel. One day as she sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, stirring tea she wasn't drinking, a little boy approached her. He couldn't have been older than 6. He had messy hair and a sweatshirt with dinosaurs on it. He carried a worn-out stuffed animal under one arm, a bobcat with stitched eyes and ears too big for its head. He looked up at her and asked simply, "Did you see it?" She blinked. "See what?" "The cat. It only comes to sad people." Before she could answer, his mother called him from across the room. He ran off without another word, leaving her frozen in place. No one else had mentioned a bobcat, not the doctors, not the press, not even the other passengers' families. Only she had seen it, and now, a child too. Later, she asked the nurse if children were staying in this wing. The nurse looked confused. There haven't been any child patients on this floor in weeks. Was it possible? Maybe, maybe not. But something about that moment felt familiar, like a thread connecting something she hadn't fully seen yet. Elena began writing, not for anyone else, just for herself. Pages of memories, thoughts she couldn't say out loud, sketches of the crash of Hazel and inevitably of the bobcat, always with those keen eyes. In one entry she wrote, It didn't save me because I was special. It saved me because I was supposed to see what being saved feels like. Not triumph, not glory, but grief cracked open and the choice to breathe anyway. Sometimes surviving doesn't feel like winning. Sometimes it feels like carrying a weight no one else can see. But even in that, especially in that there is meaning, the pain of staying becomes the doorway to something deeper. Remembrance, restoration, and slowly return. If you've ever lost someone and wondered why you were the one left behind, know this: your breath still matters. Your pain has purpose, and healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering and still choosing to live. As Elena began to face the truth of being alive, something else stirred beneath her grief. A memory quiet but persistent. Not of Hazel, not of the crash, but of those eyes, watching, waiting, and soon they would lead her somewhere even deeper, back to where it all began. Some encounters never fully leave you. They stay beneath the surface like gentle tides rising quietly in dreams, in memories, in the stillness before sleep. For Elena, it was always the eyes. They haunted her, not in fear, but in mystery. She didn't know why they stayed with her. She only knew they did. A few weeks after the crash, once the cameras quieted and the phone calls slowed, she did something no one expected. She didn't return to Missoula. She didn't try to restart her life. Instead, she rented a car, packed a small duffel bag, and drove northeast toward the Cascade Valley Wildlife Preserve, a place she hadn't visited since she was 12. Back then, their mother had taken them and Hazel there every summer. They used to volunteer for half days, cleaning enclosures, folding towels, refilling food bins. It wasn't glamorous, but to a child who loved animals, it felt sacred. Elena remembered the scent of cedar chips and warm hay, the creak of the wooden walkways, and the quiet hush people used when they entered the sanctuary zone. It was like stepping into a different world, one where time slowed and everything breathed with a different rhythm. That's where she met Howard Gentry. Howard was the former head ranger, long retired, but still known around the preserve like a legend in boots. He'd once been in charge of emergency rescues across the entire valley. Elena found him in the same wooden cabin she remembered from childhood, now used as an unofficial archive and resting spot for volunteers. His beard was whiter, his hands more weathered, but his eyes were just as clear. He didn't ask many questions when she introduced herself. Just listened, leaning back in a creaky chair as she told him haltingly, then with more certainty, about the bobcat she saw at her mother's fence at the runway and in the wreckage. She expected disbelief, a smile, a kind "you were under stress," but Howard didn't laugh. Instead, he stood slowly, walked to a metal file cabinet and pulled out a thin yellowed folder. "You might be talking about Ash," he said, placing the folder in her lap. Inside were a few old photographs and a sparse report. A juvenile male bobcat brought in after being caught in a leg trap near the northern boundary, rescued, treated for injury, released 6 months later after rehabilitation. One sentence was underlined in pencil: "Unusually calm behavior. Shows comfort around women. Scar on front left paw." Elena felt her breath catch. "The scar," she whispered. "I didn't even mention it." Howard nodded. Ash wasn't like other bobcats. Never was. Most of them, you patch them up, feed them, and they're gone like shadows. But this one, he stayed, watched people, walked beside you without sound, like he knew where you were going before you did. She ran her fingers across the grainy photo. The eyes were there, faint but unmistakable. The same quiet intensity, the same unreadable depth. "Where did he go?" she asked. Howard shrugged. "That's the thing. He disappeared. One winter there was a big fire near Granite Ridge. Took out half the lower forest. After that, no sign. We figured he didn't make it, but Elena wasn't convinced. She remembered the way he stood in the smoke, not like something that had survived, but something that had returned." Howard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're not the first." "What do you mean?" He stood again and pulled another folder. This one was thinner, just a handwritten letter and a blurry photo. A hiker in the Sweeney foothills broke his leg in a fall. Said a wild cat sat beside him the whole night until help came. Swears it wasn't a cougar. Said the eyes were different. He called it a ghost. Another page. A woman in her 70s, trapped in her home during a snowstorm, claimed she saw a bobcat sitting at her back door just minutes before her neighbor arrived with a snowplow. She described the same scar, the same stare. These are just stories, Howard admitted. No one ever captures him. No trail cams, no tracks that lead anywhere. But the people who see him, they never forget. And they all survive something. Elena sat back, heart thudding gently in her chest. Ash wasn't just an animal. He was something older than fear. A presence that arrived in moments when death came close but didn't stay. That night, Elena stayed in a guest cabin just outside the preserve. She sat by the window for hours, sketchbook in hand. She drew slowly without intention. Lines formed, shadows filled in. When she finished, she saw him. There he was on the page. Ash. Not just the bobcat, but the moment, the fire behind him. The world is collapsing, and those eyes, not glowing, not wild, just still. Later, she wrote a single line beneath the sketch. He didn't come to save me. He came to show me I could save myself. Not every guardian has wings or speaks in words. Sometimes protection arrives in forms we don't understand, in the calm presence of a creature that shouldn't be there, in a glance that tells us to move, to trust, to breathe. The world doesn't always explain these moments, but that doesn't make them any less real. If you've ever felt watched over even when no one was around, maybe you were. And maybe, just maybe, the world still has its quiet protectors waiting in the shadows until we need them most. Eleanor came to Cascade Valley searching for the truth. But what she found was something older, something passed between generations in whispers and glances. And soon those whispers would lead her not just back into the forest, but back into memory, and into a promise made long before the sky turned to fire. Grief doesn't knock when it enters. It just walks in sometimes while you're pouring coffee or standing in line at the post office or staring out at a forest that no longer looks the same. And sometimes it shows up in a memory so vivid, so unexpected that it steals the breath from your chest. For Elena, that moment came when she found Hazel's backpack. She had returned to the crash site weeks after her visit to Cascade Valley. The investigation was long over. Most of the wreckage had been cleared. But the forest still whispered its memory, and someone from the recovery team had left behind a small container labeled sealed and sitting alone beneath a tarp. Inside was the last of what they found: 2 burnt wallets, 1 metal earring, a melted phone, and a weathered canvas backpack zipper half broken. The fabric still smelling faintly of peppermint gum and vanilla hand lotion. It was Hazel's. Eleanor took it home to the guest house. She didn't open it at first. She placed it on the bed, just stared at it. It felt like a doorway she wasn't ready to walk through, but at 2 a.m., when sleep refused to come, she unzipped the bag. Inside were the usual things: a small sketchbook, half a chocolate bar, a folded sweater, and tucked into one of the side pockets, flattened, slightly bent, was a photo. Eleanor hadn't seen it in years. It was from a family trip to Glacier National Park. She and Hazel must have been 7 and 9. In the picture, they stood side by side, wearing matching raincoats, holding hands. Behind them was a steep forest trail, mist curling around the trees. And sitting right at the edge of the photo, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a shape. Small, furry, ears pointed, a bobcat. Elena's heart stopped. She hadn't noticed it before. No one had, but now, with everything that had happened, she couldn't unsee it. Had it been following them all this time? The memory came like a flood. That day they had wandered off the main trail. It was raining and the fog had rolled in faster than expected. Elena had panicked, tears shaking, convinced they were lost. But Hazel had taken her hand and said something she never forgot. If we stop being afraid, the forest will remember who we are. She didn't understand what that meant then, but Hazel had always been that way, half wild, half poet. She believed the world was listening, that animals could sense emotion, that trees held stories. And somehow that day they found their way back. No GPS, no markers, just instinct and trust. Now Elena understood. Hazel had been her compass then, and now she was gone. The grief she had held at bay, tucked behind doctor's appointments, polite interviews, and quiet drives, came crashing forward. She curled into the blanket, clutching the photograph to her chest, and let herself feel it fully. The weight, the loneliness, the unshakable guilt of waking up in a world where Hazel didn't exist anymore. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. A question. Not why did Hazel die? Elena had stopped trying to find reasons in tragedy. But why had she survived? Why had Ash, if that was him, appeared to her? She looked at the bobcat in the corner of the photo again. It hadn't been facing the camera. It had been facing her. The memories piled on after that. A camping trip where Hazel claimed she saw a glowing cat outside the tent. A dream Elena once had of a golden animal guarding their doorway. A carved wooden figure their mother had kept on the windowsill for years, its shape suspiciously feline. Had it always been there? Had they just never paid attention? She sat by the window until sunrise, Hazel's sweater wrapped around her shoulders. Outside, the forest glowed amber and gold. Morning mist drifted low across the field, catching on the tips of the tall grass. For the first time in weeks, Elena didn't feel alone. She picked up her journal and wrote one sentence. Some presences don't appear when you ask. They appear when your soul is cracked wide enough to see them. Memory has a way of choosing its moment to return. Sometimes we bury things we're not yet strong enough to hold. But when they rise through a photo, a scent, a sound, they offer more than pain. They offer clarity. They remind us of who we were and what we've been carrying all along. If you've ever had a memory hit you like a wave, sudden, raw, and full of truth, you're not alone. Those moments are not setbacks. They're invitations to heal, to remember, and sometimes to believe. That night, Elena fell asleep with Hazel's photo beside her, and the window cracked open as if waiting for something to return. But what came next wasn't a memory. It was a sign. One left not in words, but in claw marks, and it would take her straight back to the place where her life had ended, and quietly, impossibly, began again. The truth, Elena would later realize, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly, stubbornly, in places others avoid, in burned-out ground, in places filled with ash and memory, in the wreckage no one wants to revisit. She returned to the crash site alone. The forest had changed. What once was thick with pine and shadow was now a raw scar across the land. The soil was blackened in places, new grass pushing up timidly through the char. Trees that had once stood tall now slumped or split, their bark peeled like old paper. But the air was still, peaceful in a way that felt almost reverent. The authorities had cleared most of the debris. Yellow tape still fluttered from a bent tree branch near the slope. Signs warned trespassers, but Elena wasn't trespassing. Not really. She wasn't there to take. She was there to understand. With careful steps, she followed the path marked weeks earlier by rescue teams. Her boots pressed softly into the earth, each step echoing louder in her ears than it did in the forest. Her palms were sweating despite the cool breeze. She carried nothing but a notebook, her pendant, and Hazel's photo folded carefully in her jacket pocket. It didn't take long to find it. The place where she had crawled free. The hillside dipped suddenly, as if the earth itself had bowed in grief. Metal shards were still embedded in the roots. A melted armrest lay half buried in moss. And not far from that, almost hidden beneath a curl of torn fuselage, was the twisted frame of seat 14F. Her seat. Elena dropped to her knees, breath catching in her throat. The seat was barely recognizable. Charred, warped, but the metal brace that once connected it to the wall was still intact, and across it, just beneath the blackened edge, were 4 distinct curved slashes. Parallel, uneven. deep. She reached forward, hand trembling. They weren't tool marks. They weren't from debris. They were claws. The air shifted. A breeze stirred the grass, and suddenly she remembered clearly, as if her body had stored it without her permission the moment she saw him. The bobcat, standing just there, in the gap between the wreckage and the fire. These were his marks. Not a metaphor, not a vision, real, proof. And yet, standing there, Elena didn't feel vindicated. She felt still. More than anything, she felt seen, as if the universe had left behind a note, but written in the language of fur and instinct. She pulled out her notebook and traced the claw marks carefully. Then, without fully understanding why, she opened her palm and placed the moon pendant gently onto the seat frame. Not to let go, but to give thanks. To mark the place where breath began again. After some time, she stood, and just before she turned to leave, she noticed something else on the underside of the fuselage, partially shielded from the rain, a faint imprint in the soot. A paw print. Clear. Single. Like a signature. Like a farewell. That night, back in her cabin, Elena didn't sleep. She sketched everything she saw, not just the claw marks, but the curve of the hill, the pattern of trees, the color of the sky at dusk. She wanted to remember it exactly, not as a ghost story, but as a truth too sacred for language. And as she sketched, she remembered something her mother once told her. Animals don't leave trails for others. They leave them for the ones meant to follow. Sometimes the signs we seek don't come as words or explanations. They come as quiet confirmations, claw marks in metal, a breeze at the right moment, the feeling that you were never truly alone. It's not about proving anything to the world. It's about recognizing what's been guiding you all along. If you've ever felt something was there for you, just for you, hold on to it. You don't need permission to believe in what only you could see. Elena thought the trail might end there in fire and silence and metal. But she was wrong. Because some stories don't leave you behind. They keep calling you forward. And what was called next came not from the wreckage, but from a child and a gift carved from wood. Some turning points don't arrive with a bang. They come folded, handwritten, quietly delivered when the soul is just tired enough to listen. It had been nearly 3 months since the crash when Elena found the letter. By then she had returned to Missoula, not to stay but to rest. Her cabin in Cascade Valley was still open to her, but her body needed medical follow-ups and her mind needed stillness. She walked slowly now with a cane when the terrain was rough, and her left arm still bore the faint outline of healing burns. But what lingered more than the pain was the emptiness. She ate quietly, slept little, drew when she could. The sketchbook was nearly full now. Bobcats, firelight, claw marks. Hazel's smile, the slope of the crash site at dawn, but each drawing seemed to ask a question she still couldn't answer. Why me? Why now? And what was she supposed to do with this life she hadn't expected to keep? Then came the envelope. It was thin with no return address. Just her name was written in pencil on the front in careful, almost childlike script. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. At the top was a short sentence scrawled in blue ink. I read your story in class. It made me feel like maybe the world still has magic. The letter was from a boy named Liam, 8 years old, from a small elementary school in Bristol, Vermont. His teacher had found Elena's story online, not the news articles, but a blog post someone had quietly shared from a community website. A retired therapist she once confided in had published it anonymously. The title read simply, The Eyes That Stayed With Me. Liam wrote that he had been in a car crash a year earlier, that he and his mother survived, but their dog didn't. That since then he'd been afraid of riding in cars, afraid of loud noises, afraid of sleeping near windows. But when I read about how you saw the bobcat, he wrote, I thought, maybe something was watching me too. Maybe not to save me, but to help me not be afraid. I haven't seen anything yet, but I leave a little bit of peanut butter outside my window now, just in case. Elena folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic, but something about it, something in the quiet honesty moved her more than any headline ever could. This child wasn't thanking her for surviving. He was thanking her for believing. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Maybe the Bobcat hadn't just come for her. Maybe it had come through her for someone else. Later that week, she printed the photo, the one taken years ago in Glacier Park, the one where she and Hazel stood under the mist with that nearly invisible figure in the background. She added a caption beneath it in soft graphite. "We don't always get to choose who sees the wild things, but when we do, maybe we're meant to pass them on." Then she did something she hadn't dared do until then. She opened the folder she kept labeled "One Day." Inside were the rough beginnings of a manuscript, not a memoir, not a news report, a story, a children's story. She titled it "The Eyes in the Smoke." It began like this. On the day the sky forgot how to be blue, a girl sat in the quiet fire of her own sadness. And something stepped through the smoke, not to speak, not to stay, but to watch. And in that watching, she remembered how to find her way home. Elena spent the next 3 weeks polishing every line. She didn't embellish. She didn't add what hadn't happened. But she translated it into a language that children could hold, the language of symbols, of safety, of small magic. She sent the manuscript to a local publisher, a small non-profit that produced storybooks for children in hospitals and shelters. No agent, no resume, just a cover letter that read, "If even one child finds peace in this, then it's already done what it came here to do." She didn't expect a reply. But 2 weeks later, one came. They wanted to publish it, not widely, not for bookstores, but as part of a special project, a limited run to be shared in trauma centers, pediatric care units, and grief circles for children who'd experienced sudden loss. Elena agreed. No payment, no publicity, just one request that each copy include a note on the inside cover to the child who needed to be reminded the world still sees you. The first batch arrived by mail in late November. She held the book in her hands, small, soft bound, warm to the touch. Illustrated simply but beautifully. And on the final page, a full spread, a bobcat in a forest of cinders' eyes, glowing not with power, but with quiet knowing. That night, she returned to the trail behind her cabin and left one copy at the base of a cedar tree. No note, no explanation, just a quiet offering. And when she turned back, something flickered at the edge of the trees, a shadow low to the ground. She didn't follow it, didn't call out. She just stood there in the cold, breathing, watching the woods as the moon rose high, and smiled. Sometimes healing doesn't come from finding answers. It comes by becoming one. When you allow your survival to light a path for someone else, especially someone you'll never meet, that's where the quiet magic lives. In the passing of comfort, in the invisible thread of shared wonder. If someone else's story has ever helped you feel less alone, consider what yours might do for someone else. You don't have to write a book, just be honest. Someone might be waiting to feel seen. Elena thought the story might end there, with pages printed, a few children touched, and the world moving on. But just when she had begun to settle into stillness, someone knocked. Someone from the past, and with them a truth she hadn't been ready to hear. Until now. Most trails have signs, blazes on trees, footprints in mud, a path worn by time and repetition, but some trails don't work that way. They aren't carved into the ground. They are carved into us, and if you try to follow them with your eyes, you'll miss them entirely. You have to walk with something else, with instinct, with memory, with trust. That was how Elena found her way back to the foothills of Granite Ridge. It wasn't in her plans. She had started to believe her journey with Ash had ended. The book had gone out. Letters from parents, nurses, and even other survivors had begun to trickle in. Each one is small. Each one was a reminder that something real had been passed on. She felt grateful, even at peace. But one morning, as she returned from a quiet walk through town, she found a message waiting at the cabin. A handwritten note slipped under the door. No envelope, no name. Just 6 words. "I think you should come back." And beneath it, a printed image. Grainy, from a trail camera. A photo of a bobcat, small frame, upright posture, head turned slightly to the side. It was the eyes that caught her. Not glowing, just still. A local ranger had seen it near a former watch post, not far from where Ash had first been released years ago. Elena didn't hesitate. The next day, she drove 3 hours north, then hiked in with the help of a young guide named Mason, someone who had grown up hearing the old stories of the guardian bobcat, but had never believed them. Until now. The forest near Granite Ridge was older than it looked. Trees creaked without wind. Roots curled around stone like they had stories to tell. The ground was soft, spongy in places, and the canopy filtered the sunlight into quiet, golden dust. They set up a small camp near a ridge that overlooked a long valley, one where fire had passed through nearly a decade ago, leaving behind a mixture of scars and rebirth. Mason told her that bobcats were rarely seen here anymore. Too much human activity, too few places left to hide. But Ash, if it was him, was still choosing to return. On the second evening, Elena sat alone by the fire while Mason took a walk around the nearby ravine. She stared into the trees, her sketchbook resting on her knees, though she hadn't drawn in hours. The fire crackled. An owl called from the distance, and then barely audible a rustle. Not the sharp snap of a large animal, not the nervous scampering of prey, but the careful, quiet sound of something confident, something that moved like it belonged there. She turned her head. At the far edge of the clearing, beneath a low cedar branch, stood a figure. Small, sturdy, fur brushed with gray and amber. Ash. He didn't move toward her. He didn't move away. He simply looked. And in that gaze, Elena felt it not words, not thoughts, but something deeper. Recognition. Not just of her, but of the journey. He had been there, at the fence, at the runway, in the wreckage, maybe even in the photo from Glacier. Or maybe not always physically. Maybe what mattered more was when he appeared at the edge of decision, the brink of surrender, the moment before retreat. And now, he had come once more. Not to guide, not to save, but to complete something. Elena didn't stand, didn't speak. She simply placed a hand over her heart, nodded once, and let the tears come not from grief this time, but from grace. Ash blinked, then turned, and walked back into the trees. No sound, no fanfare, just gone. That night she sat beneath the stars, fingers resting on the crescent moon pendant that now hung low from years of wear. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small stone she had collected weeks earlier, a fragment from the crash site still darkened at one edge. She buried it beneath the cedar where Ash had stood, a marker not for death, but for passage. The trail he had shown her hadn't been through wilderness, it had been through sorrow, and now it had led her back to herself. The next morning, as they packed to leave, a young girl appeared on the trail barefoot with tangled hair and a bundle of carved wood figures in a satchel. She didn't speak much English, but Mason recognized her. She lived in a nearby village. Her family tended bees and made herbal tea from pine needles. The girl looked at Elena, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a small wooden carving. A bobcat, delicate, detailed, and shaped by hand. Elena took it gently. "Did you make this?" The girl didn't answer. She just pointed to the forest. Mason translated softly. "She says when someone sees something and survives, they leave a gift behind. It's their way of saying thank you." Elena nodded, overcome. Not long after they hiked down in silence. Some trails aren't marked for others to follow. They're meant for just one person, just once. And the proof of the path isn't in photos or signs or stories others believe. It's in the change it leaves inside you, in the quiet courage you carry forward. If you've ever walked a road no one else could see, trust that it was yours for a reason. And if something guided you there, maybe it's time to guide someone else. When Elena returned home, she placed the wooden Bobcat beside Hazel's photo. No altar, no candles, just a small, quiet space, but sometimes that's all you need. And somewhere out there, beneath trees older than memory, a trail still exists, seen only by those willing to believe.
Stray dog refused water for days. Then the vet touched her belly and screamed. Under the harsh blaze of the late afternoon sun, the old gravel path leading to the abandoned firing range shimmered with heat. Martin Gray, 39 years old, moved slowly but deliberately through the tall, dry grass. His left pant leg was neatly folded and pinned above the knee, the prosthetic limb beneath making a soft thud with every step. The forest around him was quiet, the kind of silence that had once meant danger in the deserts of Helmand. Now it was just another quiet day near the edge of nowhere. Martin had lived alone in a weathered cabin nestled among the pines for the past 2 years. After an improvised explosive device had claimed his leg and several of his squad mates during a patrol in Afghanistan, the former Special Operations Sergeant had withdrawn from everything. His military career, the city, even the people who tried to help. The forest gave him solitude, but not peace. He woke most mornings before dawn with sweat clinging to his skin, memories flaring like muzzle flashes in his mind. Most days he walked. That was his routine. Walk, breathe, survive. Today he was checking the range, what was once a training ground, now overgrown and rusted with time. As he stepped around the remnants of a collapsed shooting post, he saw something in the dirt about 20 yards ahead. A shape. Small, dark, still. He raised his hand to block the glare. It was a dog, a German shepherd by the looks of it. She was lying on her side, ribs visible beneath a filthy coat, chest rising barely enough to suggest she was still breathing. Her eyes were half-lidded, dull, unfocused. But as Martin took a cautious step forward, a low, guttural growl vibrated from her throat. She did not move, did not bark, just growled, as if to say, "Come closer and we both suffer." Martin stopped. He crouched slowly, one hand pressing against his knee to stabilize his balance with the prosthetic. He did not speak. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes earned more trust than words. The dog made no attempt to rise. Her back legs were stiff, unmoving. Flies buzzed around a crusted wound on her side. Martin reached into his pack and set down a can of dog food and a bottle of water. He opened the food, pulled back the lid with care, and slid it forward with a stick. Then he retreated 10 feet and sat on a nearby stump. He watched. She did not touch it. The next day, Martin returned. The food was untouched, the water spilled. The dog had not moved, but her eyes met his. There was something behind them, not hope exactly, but defiance. She was not ready to die, even if her body was. Martin let out a slow breath. "All right, girl," he said quietly. "We're doing this." Using his jacket, he wrapped her gently. She did not resist, but she flinched when his hand neared her belly. Martin lifted her carefully, balancing her weight on his good side. The walk back to the truck was nearly a mile. Each step was a battle. The pain in his lower back flared. The prosthetic groaned under the extra strain. But he did not stop. The veterinary clinic was a small one-room office 30 minutes away. Martin kicked open the door with his foot and laid the dog gently on the examination table. The veterinarian, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Harris, approached quickly, snapping on gloves. As her hands moved down the dog's side, she paused. Her fingers pressed lightly against the dog's abdomen. Then she screamed. "Jesus! There's a bullet. It's still inside her." She pulled her hand back. Her gloves were already stained with blood. "It's deep, and the tissue's infected. Necrotic. This dog has been dying for weeks." Martin stared at the dog, at the way her breath trembled in her chest, at the strength it must have taken for her to lie there in silence, guarding her pain like a soldier guarding a post. "She's a fighter," he said, voice low. Dr. Harris looked up. "If we do not operate now, she will not survive the night." Martin nodded. "Then what are you waiting for?" She blinked, then turned to call for prep. Martin rested his hand on the dog's head. For a brief second, her eyes flicked toward him. "She's not just a stray," he whispered. "She's a survivor." The clinic smelled of antiseptic and faint pine-scented cleaner. The walls were lined with photos of adopted pets and thank-you notes scribbled in children's handwriting, but Martin saw none of it. He sat in the same chair for 3 hours, barely blinking, never touching the vending machine snacks or the coffee offered by the receptionist. He kept his eyes on the steel double doors at the end of the hall, the ones that had swallowed up the limp, bloodied body of the dog he had carried in his arms. He could still feel the warmth of her fur against his chest, still remember how she had not whimpered or growled when he lifted her. She had simply gone still, trusting him for no reason other than she had run out of options. That kind of surrender, born not of weakness but of exhaustion, felt all too familiar. Dr. Harris finally emerged, her surgical gown dotted with red and her expression weary. She pulled down her mask and exhaled heavily before meeting Martin's eyes. "She survived," she said quietly, "but just barely." Martin stood, his prosthetic clicking as he shifted weight onto his good leg. How bad was it? The bullet was deep, likely fired from close range. It tore through muscle and clipped part of her intestine. Infection had already started spreading. "If you had found her a day later—" She trailed off. She did not need to finish the sentence. Martin nodded, jaw tightening. "But she made it." Dr. Harris gave a tired smile. "Yes, she made it." He looked down the hallway where behind those doors the dog lay sedated, breathing softly with machines tracking every beat of her battered heart. He thought of the hole in her side, the flies, the sun beating down on her limp frame. And the growl. Even at her weakest, she had guarded her pain like something sacred. He looked back at Dr. Harris. "Her name is Valor." She tilted her head. "Valor? Because she fought when no one knew she was fighting. Because she never gave up." His voice was steady, quiet. "Because she reminds me of what I forgot." Dr. Harris glanced at the clipboard in her hand. "Once she is stable, I can recommend a few good rescue centers that handle trauma cases. They'll—" "No," Martin said firmly. "She is not just a stray. She is a survivor. Like me." The vet paused, then nodded slowly. "You know it will not be easy. She will need antibiotics, daily wound care, physical support, maybe even surgery again down the line, and she may never fully trust." "I am not asking for easy," he replied. "I am asking for a chance." Later that evening, Martin returned to his cabin with a small list of medications, syringes, gauze pads, and a quiet resolve building inside him. He cleaned the spare room, cleared the floor near the fireplace, and laid out a folded quilt from his army footlocker. It had belonged to his mother, worn but warm. He adjusted the space heater, tested it, retested it. The next morning, Valor arrived in a crate too big for her small frame, eyes glazed with sedation but chest rising steadily. Martin carried her inside, his grip steady, voice soft. "It is not much," he murmured, laying her down gently, "but it is home." He learned to clean her stitches, to slide the needle just right under her skin for injections. She flinched the first time. By the third, she barely stirred. He talked to her as he worked, not loud, not demanding, just words in the quiet, about the war, about the heat, about the explosion and the fire and the silence after. He never expected her to understand. But one night, as he sat on the floor beside her makeshift bed, his back aching, his hands stained with ointment, she opened her eyes and rested her head on his thigh. Neither of them moved for a long time. A man who had forgotten how to care. A dog who had never known what care could be. Two warriors. Both broken, both healing. The cabin creaked under the steady rhythm of rain. Outside, the forest soaked in silence. Trees bowed under the weight of water, and the wind whispered like memories trying to return. Inside, it was warmer now. There was soup simmering on the stove, a soft light casting shadows along the wooden walls, and beside the hearth Valor slept, curled tightly on her old army blanket, her breathing still uneven but stronger than it had been. Martin moved slowly across the room, a pot in one hand, a wooden spoon in the other, his prosthetic leg clicking faintly with each step. He stopped near her bed and knelt with a slight wince, ladling warm broth into a bowl and placing it beside her. "Chicken and rice," he said softly. "Nothing fancy, but I used to beg for this stuff in the hospital. That and the lemon pudding." Valor stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She sniffed the bowl, nudged it slightly, then began to eat, careful, quiet. Martin smiled. "That's my girl." Later, as she dozed again, he sat in his recliner with a folded photo album in his lap. He opened it to a worn page. There, faded but clear, was an image of him, before the blast. Both legs, a crooked grin. The men around him wore the same grin, like they had not yet seen the worst day of their lives. "I was out for days after it happened," Martin said aloud, eyes never leaving the photo. "When I woke up, the room smelled like bleach and morphine. First thing I did was reach down, and there was nothing there." He swallowed. No pain, just absence. Valor stirred in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her throat. Martin leaned back, eyes damp. "The doctors said I was lucky, but it did not feel like luck. It felt like something had been carved out of me, something more than just bone." That night, the rain grew heavier. The roof moaned as gusts of wind swept across the clearing. Martin stood to check the back door, where a draft sometimes slipped through. As he stepped into the hallway, his crutch caught on a damp towel he had forgotten near the door. In an instant, his balance shifted and he fell hard to the floor, a sharp grunt echoing off the walls. Pain shot through his ribs. The prosthetic leg twisted awkwardly beneath him, his hands scrabbling for a grip that wasn't there. "Damn it," he hissed. Silence. Then, scraping, the soft thump of paws on wood. Valor emerged from the main room, limping but moving. She came to his side, her eyes wide with alarm. "It's okay," Martin murmured, but his arms trembled. Then Valor did something he would never forget. She crouched beside him, pushed her weight under his shoulder, and braced herself. He felt the tension in her body, the effort, the strength. With a sharp breath, he leaned into her, pressing his palm to the floor and his weight to her side. Slowly, with her beneath him like a living crutch, he rose. The moment he stood, swaying slightly, she looked up at him, her eyes steady. Martin placed a hand on her neck, voice cracked. "You saved me, girl, again." That night something shifted. From then on, Martin began each morning with purpose. He adjusted his prosthetic carefully. He stretched longer, walked farther. When the pain came, he did not retreat to the chair. He kept moving. Not for pride, not for spite. For her, because Valor needed him whole. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to become that man again. Not the one who had lost, but the one who still had something to give. The smoke had come without warning. One moment the air outside Martin's cabin was crisp and still, scented with pine and early autumn. The next, it was thick with the smell of burning. A distant orange glow bled through the trees, and the wind began to carry the low, thunderous roar of approaching flame. Martin stepped out onto the porch, his breath catching. The fire line was moving faster than any news bulletin could report, eating through the dry forest like it had been waiting for this moment all summer. He scanned the sky, his instincts honed by years in the military, telling him what the silence between the crackles meant. People would be caught off guard. He turned back into the house. "Valor!" he called. She was already there, standing by the door, tail still, ears forward. Martin strapped on his prosthetic leg and grabbed his pack, first aid kit, flashlight, extra water, flare. It had been years since he moved this fast, and every step was a battle against the uneven terrain and his own memories. But Valor stayed at his side, eyes flicking to him with every motion, checking his pace, adjusting her stride to his rhythm. The two of them reached the trailhead that led toward a nearby ranger station. On the way, they passed a small parked SUV. Smoke curled around it. Martin paused when he heard coughing. "Help!" came a voice, weak and panicked. Martin forced himself toward the vehicle. Inside, a woman in her 20s clutched her chest, eyes wild. She had apparently gotten lost hiking and passed out in her car before realizing the fire was surrounding her. She was too disoriented to walk alone. Martin opened the door, coughing. "You're okay now, I've got you." He looped her arm over his shoulder and guided her down the slope toward the creek. Valor led the way, staying just ahead, turning back every few feet to check their progress. Martin's leg ached and his lungs burned with smoke, but they moved, one determined step at a time. When they reached the base of the hill, the smoke thickened. Martin lowered the woman beside the water. "Stay here, they'll see the clearing." He turned to Valor, panting. "Go!" She hesitated only a second before sprinting up the path again, agile despite her injury, vanishing into the smoke and heat. Martin stayed low, waving a flashlight in wide arcs, keeping the woman conscious with small talk. "What is your name? Where are you from? Breathe with me." Minutes felt like hours. Then, sirens, the low rumble of an approaching fire engine. Valor burst from the trees, barking, leading two firefighters behind her. They reached Martin and the woman, lifted her gently into the vehicle, then turned to him. "You brought her out alone?" one firefighter asked. Martin nodded, exhaling smoke. He looked down at Valor, who stood quietly by his side, muzzle singed, eyes clear. "She found you?" "No," Martin said, his voice rough. "She led you?" The firefighter looked at the dog in awe. "She is not just a pet." Martin almost smiled. "No, she is a soldier." As the fire receded behind them, the crew offered Martin water and urged him to sit. Another firefighter, clipboard in hand, approached him. "Sir, why did you go back in? That area is already under evacuation." Martin leaned on his good leg, brushing ash from his jacket. He looked at Valor, who sat proudly beside him. "Because she never gave up," Martin said, "so I could not either." The gymnasium at the local high school was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, students murmuring in curiosity, teachers guiding them to settle down. At the front, a banner stretched above the stage. Veterans Appreciation Week. Among the invited speakers that morning stood Martin, leaning slightly on a polished black cane. His suit was pressed, but modest, and beside him sat Valor, alert, calm, her coat glistening under the gym's fluorescent lights. A hush fell over the crowd as Martin stepped forward. He paused at the podium, cleared his throat, and glanced down at the dog sitting loyally at his feet. "I used to be taller," he began, and a few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "But more than that, I used to be a man who thought he would never need help. I served in special operations, Afghanistan, missions we couldn't talk about. When the mine exploded, it did not just take my leg. It took something deeper. I woke up in a military hospital with half of me gone, and the other half not sure it wanted to stay." He let the silence breathe, let the weight of that truth settle over the young faces before him. "I came home, but I didn't really come back. Not right away. I lived out in the woods, avoided people. The pain was not just physical. It was the kind that sits in your bones, in the quiet. Then, one day, I found her." Martin looked down at Valor. She lifted her head, sensing the shift in his voice. He was lying out there on the sand behind an old firing range, under the sun, refusing water, food, life. And yet she growled if you got too close, still ready to fight. That was the moment I knew we had the same wound. I looked into her eyes, and she looked into mine, and we did not see pity. We saw recognition. We knew the same pain. A girl in the front row, no more than 8 years old, raised her hand timidly. "What's her name?" Martin smiled. "Valor." The girl nodded with wide eyes. "That's a strong name." Martin nodded back, "Because she fought when no one was watching, and I knew I had to do the same." He shared the story of the operation that saved Valor's life, the recovery, the silent nights where neither could sleep, and the morning when she helped him stand after a fall. "And she does not just guard me," Martine said. "She reminds me, every single day, that healing is not about forgetting what hurt you. It's about finding someone or something that makes you want to keep going." As the assembly drew to a close, applause filled the gym. Some of the students came forward, kneeling gently to pet Valor, who leaned into their hands with quiet dignity. Later, as the sun began to fall behind the hills, casting the schoolyard in a soft amber glow, Martin walked Valor to the edge of the field behind the school. The grass was long, swaying in the breeze, warm with the last breath of daylight. Martin sat down slowly, unstrapping his prosthetic leg, letting it rest beside him. His real leg folded beneath him, and Valor curled at his side. Together they looked out at the sky, not saying anything, because nothing needed to be said. There was no more battlefield, no more hospital. Just this: a patch of grass, the rustle of trees, the breath of a dog resting beside a man who had thought he would never live again. They both lost something in war, but together they found something greater: healing. If this story touched your heart, you are not alone. Martin and Valor remind us that healing does not always come in hospitals or through words. It can come quietly, through the loyalty of a companion who never leaves your side. Sometimes the bravest warriors walk on 4 legs, and the greatest acts of courage happen long after the battlefield has gone silent. If you believe in stories of second chances, resilience, and the bond between humans and animals, subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories. Every week, we share real stories, real animals, real emotions, and sometimes, just sometimes, the story you hear may change the way you see the world. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our family, because kindness deserves to be remembered, and heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and species.